Okay, let's dive into some things that you already know. You've heard of win-win and win-lose, and those are what we call outcomes. But how do you reach those outcomes? We use styles. So we're going to look at some of the different styles that are used to manage conflict and what the potential outcomes are. I do want to just give you an image here before I go on. Is when we looked at our culture chapter, you saw that iceberg, right? And there's things on the surface that we can see, but then your cultural upbringing, for example, is what we can't see, and that's underneath the surface. And I really should include an iceberg here. I didn't think of it at the time, but really, conflict is like an iceberg. It manifests itself in your subjects, in the dirty dishes, in arguing over which restaurant to go to or how to spend the money. And it's not really about those things. That's just how it's manifested. We have to dive deep below the surface to that rest of the iceberg, which is like 90% that we can't see, play detective and find out what is contributing to this. Why are we so upset about these issues? And you have to dive deep down. It's usually unmet needs, unresolved feelings, and that's usually what's below the surface. It's just coming out in those topics. So always play detective to see what's beneath the surface. Let's go into a couple other variables that contribute to the different conflict styles. We want you to know that the different styles, we can make some generalizations about, and we're going to do that. But gender and culture do influence how we use the styles and how well they work. So just to give you some general ideas, men and women usually approach conflicts differently. Adolescent boys tend to be directly aggressive, and adolescent girls tend to be indirect in aggressiveness. Gender conflict style is stereotyped, and so it's not always the same, but they are, in general, this is how things normally or typically work. When we also think about culture, we also need to go back, or conflict, we need to go back to culture, because how we handle it depends on our cultural background. An individualistic culture whose low context is going to be more expressive and more direct because that's appropriate. It's more about me and my needs. Right? In collective cultures, that's more about the group and less about you as the individual. So their big picture is what's best for the group or what's best for the team. And because they're high context, they're not going to be as verbal or direct about it. They're going to rely more on the nonverbal. And so we manage conflicts differently also based on culture. And then you just have individual personalities that choose to handle conflicts differently, or you can look at personality assessments where you can learn more about the four different personality types, and each one has a different way of managing conflict. So then we have personality that also affect these styles. But let's dive into how to manage conflict through these different styles. So when we talk about conflict, obviously the goals are to have win-win situations, right? We don't want to have a lose-lose. And those are what we call outcomes. But how do we reach those outcomes? Right? You have to work through the conflict to get there. And so there are different styles to managing conflict or different strategies. You're going to see these in your text. There'll be a little bit of some slight differences in vocabulary, but you're going to see this in there. But it depends on the importance of achieving your goals. Is it a really large goal and super important to you, or is it a more minor issue that's not as crucial in your life? And you also consider the type of relationship that you have. And so this little image on the right of your slide indicates that if it's really high importance, that's our vertical column. And if it's a really strong, important relationship, we would go towards the top, and we'd go towards the top right corner, because that's the corner for high importance and high relationship. If it's low importance and your goals are not that big, then maybe that avoiding might be a better approach. So we like to say compromise because we think that's the good thing, or collaborating because usually both people win. But you can't always get these outcome or the outcome that you want. And so our strategies they're all valid. Sometimes we might need to avoid, sometimes we might need to accommodate, sometimes we might need to compromise, sometimes we might need to compete. And so we'll look at those variables, but this is what gives you an idea of how to pick one. I also have a summary towards the end of this PowerPoint that gives you some tips on selecting styles, but these are all valid. So you want to have them all in your tool belt and use the ones appropriately. Don't discard any of these. All right, when we avoid conflict, that's one approach. It usually leads to a lose-lose outcome. So I always have the outcome here in parentheses. When you ignore a problem, the silent treatment is actually passive-aggressive, but it is a form of avoidance, so we could put it in here as well. Pessimistic views, your attitude towards conflict can make a huge difference as well, but avoiding is passive. It might keep the peace temporarily, but it doesn't lead to satisfying relationships. And so you want to be really careful of this, that you're not just glossing over it. Because if you are all about keeping the peace on the surface, but if there's needs that are not being met, you might find resentment building up later. And so avoiding, I'm not going to say never use it, but I would use it very sparingly. You need to sometimes choose to avoid. If I imagine a potential conflict, I'm on a street, I have my girls with me, and I see somebody walking towards me that's sort of intimidating or scary, and I feel like, it's to listen to your gut, feel uncomfortable, right? I'm not secure in my environment. I'm going to avoid that. I'm not going to try to encounter or pass somebody that I am fearful of. And so that would be a good use of avoiding. Now, there wasn't technically a conflict yet, but it is an example of trying to avoid a potential conflict. Accommodating is lose-win. You lose, they win. When you allow other people to have their way instead of asserting your own point of view. Now, it is often very kind to let someone have their way. And if that is not a big deal to you, it's not one of those important issues, then be kind and allow the other person. But you have to truly allow them to have that. Because if you're not genuine about it, it will come back up. You will build up resentment because you gave in. If you do want to be kind and allow somebody to have their way, you still need to assert your point of view so that there's understanding in that relationship. Taking one for the team is different than somebody who's accommodating all the time. And so it could be done on occasion to be kind. But if you do it, lifetime accommodator, that's not a good situation. And you're going to have resentments. And when resentments grow and bitterness grows, it hurts you more than others until you explode. So you want to be careful of that. Then we have compromise. And a lot of people think this is win-win. No, it's not. A win-win situation is where both parties get everything they want. So if you have 10 things that you want and they have 10 things and you give up 3 and they give up 3, you've reached a compromise. Yay, good for you. But technically that's a lose-lose because you're not getting all of what you want and they're not getting all of what they want. And maybe it's not that important and that's okay, so you're happy about it. It's okay. But just technically, it's a lose-lose. Wouldn't it be ideal if we could get everything we want or need? And I think that does make a difference. Is it a want or are these needs? I think those do make a difference in determining how we manage our conflict and what we're willing to live with or give up. Some things are non-negotiable. And so you need to stick to your guns with those things, right? So when you both give up some of what you want, you're meeting halfway, and it seems like it's super effective, but it's not the best. And so how happy would you be if you only get half of what you needed? Again, needs and wants could be different here. So that could affect the approach. Competing is what we would call a win-lose situation. And it's not always possible to create a win-win situation as much as we would like to. Some people and personalities love conflict and they want to win at all costs. So you probably are not going to really be able to do a great job negotiating with a person like that. So when somebody else has a very competitive approach to managing conflict, they want to win and want you to lose, you don't really have the opportunity to negotiate, not usually. And so sometimes the other person, the relationship, all those things are factors in whether you can create a win-win situation or not. So competing, there's a winner and a loser. We have that in sports. You have a winner of the World Series in the Super Bowl. It doesn't end in a tie. You don't get a choice, right? There's a winner and a loser. Passive aggressive is considered a competing style. It is expressing hostility in obscure or manipulative ways. So the silent treatment, which they don't usually know you're giving them the silent treatment, so then it looks like you're avoiding it, really. But there are all those indirect approaches. It's being sneaky. It's hinting, right? It's talking to your friend that maybe who might talk to them, right? That's passive aggressive. Direct aggression is expressing hostility either verbally and or physically, right? And it could be just criticizing. Criticism, if you're not very careful in using your I language and being kind, is considered a form of aggression. Whoops, right? We all feel a little bit of guilt there. We all been critical of one another. Yes, that means we are being directly aggressive. Some people are very hostile and angry, and you can tell that they're very competitive, but sometimes it's softer. It's not always really mean. You could be very in charge, which is directly aggressive, and even be semi-nice about it. Okay, so it's not always a mean thing, competition. Okay. And our last style is collaborating. A collaboration is needed in order to create a win-win. Creating a win-win is hard. It takes time. It takes effort. It's like that group problem solving, and we don't like the time and effort it involves. And so we tend not to do it. We tend to compromise and cop out instead of achieving a win-win when you can, because it's easier. Collaborators show a high degree of concern for themselves and other people. They use assertive communication, confirming messages, that I language to express oneself, and listen to the needs of the others as well, right? We're being a competent communicator. The goal of collaboration is to find a solution that meet the needs of everyone. It requires competent communicators. So how do we do that? There are lots of different ways to do that. Our last video is going to talk about some tips on how to create a win-win. But sometimes it's hard to choose these styles. So I'm going to give you a few tips as we wrap up this video on picking a style to use. I've kind of mentioned these things as we talked through these concepts, but it's a nice summary. Think through the relationship. Okay, who is this person to you? Think about whether they have more power than you. It's like your boss at work. You would handle that differently than possibly a coworker. And so you want to consider that relationship. You might need to accommodate. There are different situations that happen, and so you would consider different styles based on the situation. The other person, like just talked about that as far as like the competitive ones. If they're very competitive, they're not going to want to collaborate. And so then we're limited on our choices on how we handle that conflict and your goals, right? You're talking about your goals and what your hopes are sometimes can calm a situation down. And so back to the chart, I have the same thing here in the upper right hand corner. It's just slightly different, but these are all in the one on the first slide of the styles that give you the tips. Use competition if it's not an important relationship, it's a strong issue, and your goal is to win at all costs, then you need to have a competitive style, right? And so all of these will give you the tips. So you can pause this, you can go back and look at the other diagram as well. Those are all tips on how to pick the best style in those situations. But don't rule any of them out. They are all valid depending on the relationship, the situation, and the goals of both parties.